Hey there, welcome to Something About Tabletop. This is going to be the fourth video in the series of how to run a Shadowrun job on the execution. Now, the execution is incredibly broad, and to be honest, I'm just going to drop a few tips and tricks to make sure that you can easily run the execution itself and make it fun for your players. By this time, this is assuming that you have worked out what type of job you want to do and what type of enemies you're against and what type of enemies really in cases what type of challenge they're going to have. So I'm just going to start with that. So we've got the corporate. The corporate has a heavy focus on matrix security, and depending on the corporation and depending on how high up the mission, there'll be some magical security as well. There are a lot of cameras around the place, and fairly decent guards on strict rotations. And of course, there is always the looming problem of high threat response teams. And generally, corporate places are in downtown, in the center near a lot of buildings, out in the open, and this can make corporate runs really deadly. You can either love or hate corporate missions, but they always pose this ever looming threat, and of course, they pay out big, so remember that. Then there's the gang mission. In the gang missions, this is generally lower level stuff, but you can have higher, more powerful gangs. And depending on the type of gang, depends on the flavor. If it's a magical gang, make sure to have more mages and magical threats, spirits, and stuff like that. And if it's not a magical gang, like say if they're a drug dealers or maybe they're cyberware dealers, make sure that they got their cyberware, make sure they have got their drugs, and that gives them a lot more character. Generally with gangs, the mooks, well, they're mooks. They're not too great. But the lieutenants and maybe special guards for the lieutenants and stuff are going to be a little bit more powerful, so give them that flavour. And whatever, of course, they push, they take. And usually gangers are the ones that are going to be taking combat drugs to take an edge. And in general, they generally have a lot more of the other meta types, more trolls and orcs and other strange meta sapiens than probably corporates would. Finally, there are Shadowrunners. Shadowrunners are batshit scary. They're a bunch of insane people, just the same as your party. And depending on what the actual circumstances means that two Shadowrun groups are versing each other, whether that be an assassination, whether that be they're doing the same job against each other, it can always get interesting because I've already mentioned this before, is that when another team gets a drop on your players, there's a big chance that someone's going to get seriously fucking hurt. Because being get a jump on this game hurts a lot. Anyway, for another tip, this is kind of just a general RPG tip as well. But Shadowrun is a serial against this because generally, say when the hacker's doing his shit, no one else is doing their shit. And the way that you can do that is by cutting between two groups of people or three groups of people, how many you have, on parts where the rules get in the way or there's tension. Say someone finally made a big check to get inside of to get a couple marks and finally got inside of the host. You cutscene. Or say if someone is actually needs to look up some rules quickly, you cutscene. And you do this every single time that you can to keep the flow of the mission going. This helps create a more engaging experience for people that have characters that necessarily aren't doing as much, just by having it cut back to them and having them make decisions. It's like, while the hacker's doing this, you on guard, make a perception check. Alright, cool. You see this and this and this is what's happening, and then they can call in on the other guys and tell them what's going on. And that works for D&D, this works for every single RPG, but Shadowrun, it's more likely to happen because you split the party all the time in Shadowrun. Okay, the next thing is try to have an encounter for every player if possible. This is kind of going for what was going on before, but say if someone's just on guard, make sure something happens. Or if nothing is going to happen because you've decided nothing would, get them into the action as well. And if the players basically refuse, either out of not understanding what you're trying to do, or maybe don't either afraid to get engaged in the game itself, or maybe aren't that interested, talk to them outside and be like, hey, what's going on? I'm trying to get you in the game. Are you sure you don't want to follow? And if they do, they do. If they don't, they don't. A bit railroady, but I've had players that basically do nothing until there's combat. And sometimes missions go off without a hitch and there is no combat. Because kind of a rule in Shadowrun is if you're doing a mission that isn't about assassination and killing, if you've gotten into combat, you've done the mission wrong. You're operatives after all. Of course, depending on your playstyle, this doesn't necessarily have to be true. Okie dokie. Next is the rule of threes. So what the rule of threes is it's a little thing that I've made up. It's nothing fantastic, and in my experience, it's worked pretty well. But all it is that it's a range of dice pools that are used for enemies: 3, 6, 3, 6, 9, 12, 5, 15. 3 being below average or crappy at it, 6 being average at it, 9 being trained, 12 being highly trained, 15 being elite. And this is generally the dice pools the players are going to be versing when the character is making an active check. In terms of dodge checks and stuff, you just got to think about what their stats are, seeing as dodging is derived from intuition and reaction. Quickly think up what you might roughly think it is. Usually 2 times an average stat, or a little bit plus, a little bit minus. And try not to have all your bad guys with those numbers as well. There is actually a collection of NPCs inside of the Shadowrun book that you can take a look at, and I would also suggest those as well. And change the guns and stuff that are there, because I mean, having people with guns, the same guns all the time, can get old. And I'm going to be honest, I'm a serial offender for that. I love my Ares stuff, Ares Predators and Ares Alphas and stuff. Anyway, that's the execution. That's pretty much all I can say about it, because these are more tips more than anything, because to be honest, the execution has a lot to do with it. This is kind of assuming that you already know what you're going to do, and either way, hopefully this helped. Anyway, thank you for listening. This was something about tabletop.